Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy-Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind troubled with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems, the ones you can't solve right now and will be easier to solve well rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. Let my voice wash over you at a comfortable volume and allow yourself to be distracted from the stresses and worries that play on your mind. Whether you need help falling asleep or going back to sleep in the middle of the night, you can trust me to keep you company and help you to wake up tomorrow in a rested state. You may need to try out Sleepy-Time Tales for a few nights to get used to the slightly strange idea, but I believe it will be well worth your while. I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So settle down, relax, and allow yourself to get lost in my telling of tonight's story. Before we get to tonight's reading, I'd like to ask for a couple of minutes of your time. Sleepy-Time Tales is a listener-supported podcast. I can only keep it going, paying for the services and tools that I use, and justify my time thanks to the generosity of listeners like you. If you're finding Sleepy-Time Tales useful, if it helps you to get a restful night and you would like to help keep it going out to thousands of insomniacs just like you, and you have the means, please consider supporting on the Patreon at patreon.com/sleepytimetales. This is monthly support that not only helps me keep the lights on, but gets you fun bonuses based on your contribution level. So go along there, take a look, and sign up if you're willing. If regular monthly support does seem like a big ask though, you can make once-off tips to the tip jar on the website. But if you'd like to support Sleepy-Time Tales without having to do so financially, you can simply spread the word. Whether in person or on social media, if you think people will benefit from listening to Sleepy-Time Tales, just let them know. And that's enough of that for tonight. Let's get on with the stories of Santa Claus. It's Christmas time, so we're returning to the life and adventures of Santa Claus by L Frank Baum. How the first stockings were hung by the chimneys. When you remember that no child, until Santa Claus began his travels, had ever known the pleasure of possessing a toy, you will understand how joy crept into the homes of those who had been favored with a visit from the good man, and how they talked of him day by day in loving tones, and were honestly grateful for his kindly deeds. It is true that great warriors and mighty kings and clever scholars of the day were often spoken of by the people, but no one of them was so greatly beloved as Santa Claus, because none of them was so unselfish as to devote himself to making others happy. For a generous deed lives longer than a great battle or a king's decree or of a scholar's essay, because it spreads and leaves its mark on all nature and endures through many generations. The bargain made with the Knook Prince changed the plans of Claus for all future time. For being able to use the reindeer on but one night of each year, he decided to devote all the other days to the manufacture of playthings, and on Christmas Eve to carry them to the children of the world. But a year's work would, he knew, result in a vast accumulation of toys. So he resolved to build a new sledge that would be larger and stronger and better fitted for swift travel than the old and clumsy one. His first act was to visit the Gnome King, with whom he made a bargain to exchange 3 drums, a trumpet, and 2 dolls for a pair of fine steel runners, curled beautifully at the ends. For the Gnome King had children of his own, who living in the hollows under the earth, in mines and caverns, needed something to amuse them. In 3 days the steel runners were ready, and when Claus brought the playthings to the Gnome King, His Majesty was so greatly pleased with them that he presented Claus with a string of sweet-toned sleigh bells in addition to the runners. "These will please Glossie and Flossie," said Claus, as he jingled the bells and listened to their merry sound. "But I should have 2 strings of bells, one for each deer." "Bring me another trumpet and a toy cat," replied the king, "and you shall have a second string of bells like the first." "It is a bargain," cried Claus, and he went home again for the toys. The new sledge was carefully built, the Knooks bringing plenty of strong but thin boards to use in its construction. Claus made a high rounding dashboard to keep off the snow cast behind by the fleet hoofs of the deer, and he made high sides to the platform so that many toys could be carried. And finally he mounted the sledge upon the slender steel runners made by the Gnome King. It was certainly a handsome sledge, and big and roomy. Claus painted it in bright colors, although no one was likely to see it during his midnight journeys, and when all was finished he sent for Glossie and Flossie to come and look at it. The deer admired the sledge, but gravely declared it was too big and heavy for them to draw. "We might pull it over the snow, to be sure," said Glossie, "but we would not pull it fast enough to enable us to visit the faraway cities and villages and return to the forest by daybreak." "Then I must add 2 more deer to my team," declared Claus, after a moment's thought. "The Knook Prince allowed you as many as 10. Why not use them all?" asked Flossie. "Then we could speed like the lightning and leap to the highest roofs with ease." "A team of 10 reindeer," cried Claus decidedly. "That will be splendid. Please return to the forest at once and select 8 other deer as like yourselves as possible. And you must all eat of the casa plant to become strong, and of the grawl plant to become fleet of foot, and of the marbon plant, that you may live long to accompany me on my journeys. Likewise, it will be well for you to bathe in the pool of Nares, which the lovely Queen Zeline declares will render you really beautiful. Should you perform these duties faithfully, there is no doubt that on next Christmas Eve, my 10 reindeer will be the most powerful and beautiful steeds the world has ever seen." So Glossie and Flossie went to the forest to choose their mates, and Claus began to consider the question of a harness for them all. In the end, he called upon Peter Knook for assistance, for Peter's heart is as kind as his body is crooked, and he is remarkably shrewd as well. And Peter agreed to furnish the strips of tough leather for the harness. This leather was cut from the skins of lions that had reached such an advanced age that they died naturally, and on one side was tawny hair, while the other side was cured to the softness of velvet by the deft Knooks. When Claus received these strips of leather, he sewed them neatly into a harness for the 10 reindeer, and it proved strong and serviceable and lasted him for many years. The harness and sledge were prepared at odd times, for Claus devoted most of his days to the making of toys. These were now much better than the first ones had been, for the immortals often came to his house to watch him work and to offer suggestions. It was Nasile's idea to make some of the dolls say Papa and Mama. It was the thought of the Knooks to put a squeak inside the lambs, so that when a child squeezed them they would say Ba. And the fairy queen advised Claus to put whistles in the birds so that they could be made to sing, and wheels on the horses so children could draw them around. Many animals perished in the forest from one cause or another, and their fur was brought to Claus that he might cover it with the small images of beasts he made for playthings. A merry roll suggested that Claus make a donkey with a nodding head, which he did, and afterward found that it amused the little ones immensely. And so the toys grew in beauty and attractiveness every day, until they were the wonder of even the immortals. When another Christmas Eve drew near, there was a monster load of beautiful gifts for the children ready to be loaded upon the big sledge. Claus filled 3 sacks to the brim, and tucked every corner of the sledge box full of toys besides. Then at twilight the 10 reindeer appeared, and Flossie introduced them all to Claus. There were Racer and Pacer, Reckless and Speckless, Fearless and Peerless, and Ready and Steady, who, with Glossie and Flossie, made up the 10 who have traversed the world these hundreds of years with their generous master. They were all exceedingly beautiful, with slender limbs, spreading antlers, velvety dark eyes, and smooth coats of fawn color spotted with white. Claus loved them at once, and has loved them ever since, for they are royal friends and have rendered him priceless service. The new harness fitted them nicely, and soon they were all fastened to the sledge by twos, with Glossie and Flossie in the lead. These wore the strings of sleigh bells and were so delighted with the music they made that they kept prancing up and down to make the bells ring. Claus now seated himself in the sledge, drew a warm robe over his knees and his fur cap over his ears, and cracked his long whip as a signal to start. Instantly the 10 leapt forward, and were away like the wind, while jolly Claus laughed gleefully to see them run, and shouted a song in his big hearty voice. With a ho 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 and a ha ha ha, and a ho ha 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 he, away we go o'er the frozen snow as merry as we can be. There are many joys in our load of toys, as many a child will know. We'll scatter them wide on our wild night ride o'er the crisp and sparkling snow. Now it was on this same Christmas Eve that little Margot and her brother Dick and her cousins Ned and Sarah, who were visiting at Margot's house, came in from making a snowman, with their clothes damp, their mittens dripping, and their shoes and stockings wet through and through. They were not scolded, for Margot's mother knew the snow was melting, but they were sent early to bed that their clothes might be hung over chairs to dry. The shoes were placed on the red tiles of the hearth, where the heat from the hot embers would strike them, and the stockings were carefully hung in a row by the chimney, directly over the fireplace. That was the reason Santa Claus noticed them when he came down the chimney that night, and all the household were fast asleep. He was in a tremendous hurry, and seeing the stockings all belonged to children, he quickly stuffed his toys into them and dashed up the chimney again, appearing on the roof so suddenly that the reindeer were astonished at his agility. I wish they would all hang up their stockings, he thought, as he drove to the next chimney. It would save me a lot of time, and I could then visit more children before daybreak. When Margot and Dick and Ned and Sarah jumped out of bed next morning and ran downstairs to get their stockings from the fireplace, they were filled with delight to find the toys from Santa Claus inside them. In fact, I think they found more presents in their stockings than any other children of that city had received, for Santa Claus was in a hurry and did not stop to count the toys. Of course, they all told their little friends about it, and of course every one of them decided to hang his own stockings by the fireplace the next Christmas Eve. Even Bessie Blithesome, who made a visit to that city with her father, the great Lord of Lurd, heard the story from the children and hung her own pretty stockings by the chimney when she returned home at Christmas time. On his next trip, Santa Claus found so many stockings hung up in anticipation of his visit that he could fill them in a jiffy and be away again in half the time required to hunt the children up and place the toys by their bedsides. The custom grew year after year and has always been a great help to Santa Claus. And with so many children to visit, he surely needs all the help we are able to give him. The first Christmas tree. Claus had always kept his promise to the Knooks by returning to the Laughing Valley by daybreak. But only the swiftness of his reindeer has enabled him to do this, for he travels all over the world. He loved his work, and he loved the brisk night ride on his sledge, and the gay tinkle of the sleigh bells. On that first trip with the 10 reindeer, only Glossy and Flossie wore bells. But each year thereafter, for 8 years, Claus carried presents to the children of the Gnome King, and that good-natured monarch gave him in return a string of bells at each visit, so that finally every one of the 10 deer was supplied. And you may imagine what a merry tune the bells played as the sledge sped over the snow. The children's stockings were so long that it required a great many toys to fill them, and soon Claus found there were other things besides toys that children love. So he sent some of the fairies, who were always his good friends, into the tropics, from whence they returned with great bags full of oranges and bananas, which they had plucked from the trees. And other fairies flew to the wonderful valley of Funnyland, where delicious candies and bonbons grew thickly on the bushes, and returned laden with many boxes of sweetmeats for the little ones. These things Santa Claus, on each Christmas Eve, placed in the long stockings, together with his toys, and the children were glad to get them, you may be sure. There are also warm countries where there is no snow in winter, but Claus and his reindeer visited them as well as in colder climes, for there were little wheels inside the runners of his sledge which permitted it to run as smoothly over bare ground as on the snow. And the children who lived in the warm countries learned to know the name of Santa Claus, as well as those who lived nearer to the Laughing Valley. Once, just as the reindeer were ready to start on their yearly trip, a fairy came to Claus and told him of 3 little children who lived beneath a rude tent of skins on a broad plain, where there were no trees whatsoever. These poor babies were miserable and unhappy, for their parents were ignorant people who neglected them sadly. Claus resolved to visit these children before he returned home, and during his ride he picked up the bushy top of a pine tree, which the wind had broken off and placed in his sledge. It was nearly morning when the deer stopped before the lonely tent of skins where the poor children lay asleep. Claus at once planted the bit of pine tree in the sand and stuck many candles on the branches. Then he hung some of his prettiest toys on the tree, as well as several bags of candies. It did not take long to do all this, for Santa Claus works quickly, and when all was ready he lighted the candles, and thrusting his head in at the opening of the tent he shouted, "Merry Christmas, little ones." With that he leapt into his sledge and was out of sight before the children, rubbing the sleep from their eyes, could come out to see who had called them. You can imagine the wonder and joy of those little ones, who had never in their lives known a real pleasure before, when they saw the tree, sparkling with lights that shone brilliantly in the grey dawn, and hung with toys enough to make them happy for years to come. They joined hands and danced around the tree, shouting and laughing, until they were obliged to pause for breath. And their parents also came out to look and wonder, and thereafter had more respect and consideration of their children, since Santa Claus had honored them with such beautiful gifts. The idea of the Christmas tree pleased Claus, and so the following year he carried many of them in his sledge and set them up in the homes of poor people who seldom saw trees, and placed candles and toys in the branches. Of course, he could not carry enough trees in one load of all who wanted them, but in some homes the fathers were able to get trees and have them all ready for Santa Claus when he arrived. And these the good Claus always decorated as prettily as possible, and hung with toys enough for all the children who came to see the tree lighted. These novel ideas and the generous manner in which they were carried out made the children long for that one night of the year when their friend Santa Claus would visit them. And as such anticipation is very pleasant and comforting, the little ones gleaned much happiness while wondering what would happen when Santa Claus next arrived. Perhaps you remember that stern Baron Braun who once drove Claus from his castle and forbade him to visit his children. Well, many years afterward, when the old Baron was dead and his son ruled in his place, the new Baron Braun came to the house of Claus with his train of knights and pages and henchmen, and dismounting from his charger, bared his head humbly before the friend of children. "My father did not know your goodness and worth," he said, "and therefore threatened to hang you from the castle walls. But I have children of my own who long for a visit from Santa Claus, and I have come to beg that you will favor them hereafter as you do other children." Claus was pleased with the speech, for Castle Braun was the only place he had never visited, and he gladly promised to bring presents to the Baron's children the next Christmas Eve. The Baron went away contented, and Claus kept his promise faithfully. Thus did this man, through very goodness, conquer the hearts of all, and it is no wonder that he was ever merry and gay, for there was no home in the wide world where he was not welcomed more royally than any king. Old age, the mantle of immortality. And now we come to a turning point in the career of Santa Claus, and it is my duty to relate the most remarkable that has happened since the world began or mankind was created. We have followed the life of Claus from the time he was found a helpless infant by the wood nymph Necile, and reared to manhood in the great forest of Bersey. And we know how he began to make toys for children, and how, with the assistance and goodwill of the immortals, he was able to distribute them to the little ones throughout the world. For many years he carried on this noble work, for the simple, hard-working life he led gave him perfect health and strength. And doubtless a man can live longer in the beautiful Laughing Valley, where there are no cares, and everything is peaceful and merry, than in any other part of the world. But when many years had rolled away, Santa Claus grew old. The long beard of golden brown that once covered his cheeks and chin gradually became grey, and finally turned to pure white. His hair was white too, and there were wrinkles in the corners of his eyes, which showed plainly when he laughed. He had never been a very tall man, and now he became fat, and waddled very much like a duck when he walked. But in spite of these things he remained as lively as ever, and was just as jolly and gay, and his kind eyes sparkled as brightly as they did that first day when he came to the Laughing Valley. Yet a time is sure to come when every mortal who has grown old and lived his life is required to leave this world for another. So it is no wonder that after Santa Claus had driven his reindeer on many and many a Christmas Eve, those staunch friends finally whispered amongst themselves that they had probably drawn his sledge for the last time. Then all the forest of Bursey became sad, and all the laughing valley was hushed, for every living thing that had known claws had used to love him, and to brighten at the sound of his footsteps or the notes of his merry whistle. No doubt the old man's strength was at last exhausted, for he made no more toys, but lay on his bed as in a dream. The nymph Necile, she who had reared him and been his foster mother, was still youthful and strong and beautiful, and it seemed to her but a short time since this aged, grey-bearded man had lain in her arms and smiled on her with his innocent baby lips. In this is shown the difference between mortals and immortals. It was fortunate that the great Uck came to the forest at this time. Necile sought him with troubled eyes and told him of the fate that threatened their friend Claus. At once the master became grave, and he leaned upon his axe and stroked his grizzled beard thoughtfully for many minutes. Then suddenly he stood up straight, and poised his powerful head with firm resolve, and stretched out his right arm as if determined on doing some mighty deed. For thought had come to him so grand in its conception, that all the world might well bow before the master woodsman and honor his name forever. It is well known that when the great Uck once undertakes to do a thing, he never hesitates an instant. Now he summoned his fleetest messengers and sent them in a flash to many parts of the earth. And when they were gone, he turned to the anxious Necile and comforted her, saying, "Be of good heart, my child. Our friend still lives. And now run to your queen and tell her that I have summoned a council of all the immortals of the world to meet me here in Bursey this night. If they obey and hearken unto my words, Claus will drive his reindeer for countless ages yet to come." At midnight there was a wondrous scene in the ancient forest of Bursey, where for the first time in many centuries the rulers of the immortals who inhabited the earth were gathered together. There was the queen of the water sprites, whose beautiful form was as clear as crystal, but continually dripped water on the bank of moss where she sat. And beside her was the king of the sleep phase, who carried a wand from the end, of which a fine dust fell all around, so that no mortal could keep awake long enough to see him, as mortal eyes were sure to close in sleep as soon as the dust filled them. And next to him sat the gnome king, whose people inhabit all that region under the earth's surface, where they guard the precious metals and the jewel stones that lie buried in rock and ore. At his right hand stood the king of the sound imps, who had wings on his feet, for his people are swift to carry all sounds that are made. When they are busy, they carry the sounds but short distances, for there are many of them, but sometimes they speed with the sounds to places miles and miles away from where they are made. The king of the sound imps had an anxious and careworn face, for most people have no consideration for his imps, and especially the boys and girls make a great many unnecessary sounds which the imps are obliged to carry when they might be better employed. The next in the circle of the immortals was the king of the wind demons, slender of frame, restless and uneasy at being confined to one place for even an hour. Once in a while he would leave his place and circle around the glade, and each time he did this, the fairy queen was obliged to untangle the flowing locks of her golden hair and tuck them back of her pink ears. But she did not complain, for it was not often that the king of the wind demons came into the heart of the forest. After the fairy queen, whose home you know was in old Bursey, came the king of the light elves with his two princes, Flash and Twilight at his back. He never went anywhere without his princes, for they were so mischievous that he dared not let them wander alone. Prince Flash bore a lightning bolt in his right hand, and a horn of gunpowder in his left, and his bright eyes roved constantly around as if he longed to use his blinding flashes. Prince Twilight held a great snuffer in one hand, and a big black cloak in the other, and it is well known that unless Twilight is carefully watched, the snuffers or the cloak will throw everything into darkness, and darkness is the greatest enemy the King of the Light Elves has. In addition to the immortals I have named were the King of the Knooks, who had come from his home in the jungles of India, and the King of the Rolls, who lived among the gay flowers and luscious fruits of Valencia. Sweet Queen Zelene of the wood nymphs completed the circle of immortals. But in the center of the circle sat 3 others who possessed powers so great that all the kings and queens showed them reverence. These were Uck, the master woodsman of the world, who rules the forests and the orchards and the groves, and Kern, the master husbandman of the world, who rules the grain fields and the meadows and the gardens, and Bo, the master mariner of the world, who rules the seas and all the craft that float thereon, and all other immortals are more or less subject to these 3. When all had assembled, the master woodsman of the world stood up to address them, since he himself had summoned them to council. Very clearly he told them the story of Claus, beginning at the time when, as a babe, he had been adopted as a child of the forest, and telling of his noble and generous nature and his lifelong labors to make children happy. And now, said Uck, when he had won the love of all the world, the spirit of death is hovering over him. Of all men who have inhabited the earth, none other so well deserves immortality, for such a life cannot be spared so long as there are children of mankind to miss him, and to grieve over his loss. We immortals are the servants of the world, and to serve the world we were permitted in the beginning to exist. But what one of us is more worthy of immortality than this man Claus, who so sweetly ministers to the little children? He paused and glanced around the circle, to find every immortal listening to him eagerly and nodding approval. Finally, the king of the wind demons, who had been whistling softly to himself, cried out, "What is your desire, O Uck?" "To bestow upon Claus the mantle of immortality," said Uck boldly. That this demand was wholly unexpected was proved by the immortals springing to their feet and looking into each other's face with dismay, and then upon Uck with wonder. For it was a grave matter, this parting with the mantle of immortality. The queen of the water sprites spoke in her low, clear voice, and the words sounded like raindrops splashing upon a window pane. "In all the world there is but one mantle of immortality," she said. The king of the sound phase added, "It has existed since the beginning, and no mortal has ever dared to claim it." And as the master mariner of the world arose and stretched his limbs, saying, "Only by the vote of every immortal can it be bestowed upon a mortal." "I know all this," answered Uck quietly. "But the mantle exists, and if it was created, as you say, in the beginning, it was because the Supreme Master knew that some day it would be required. Until now, no mortal has deserved it. But who among you dares deny that the good Claus deserves it? Will you not all vote to bestow it upon him?" They were silent, still looking upon one another questioningly. "Of what use is the mantle of immortality unless it is worn?" demanded Uck. "What will it profit any one of us to allow it to remain in its lonely shrine for all time to come?" Enough, cried the Gnome King abruptly. We will vote on the matter, yes or no. For my part, I say yes. And I, said the Fairy Queen promptly, and Uck rewarded her with a smile. My people in Bursey tell me they have learned to love him. Therefore I vote to give Claus the mantle, said the King of the Rolls. He is already a comrade of the Gnooks, announced the ancient king of that band. Let him have immortality. Let him have it, sighed the king of the wind demons. Why not? Asked the king of the sleep phase. He never disturbs the slumbers my people allow humanity. Let the good Claus be immortal. I do not object, said the king of the sound imps. Nor I, murmured the queen of the water sprouts. If Claus does not receive the mantle, it is clear none other can ever claim it, remarked the king of the light elves. So let us have done with the thing for all time. The wood nymphs were first to adopt him, said Queen Zerline. Of course I shall vote to make him immortal. Uck now turned to the master husbandman of the world, who held up his right arm and said yes. And the master mariner of the world did likewise, after which Uck, with sparkling eyes and smiling face, cried out, I thank you, fellow immortals, for all have voted yes. And so to our dear Claus shall fall the one mantle of immortality that it is in our power to bestow. Let us fetch it at once, said the Fey King. I'm in a hurry. They bowed assent, and instantly the forest glade was deserted. But in a place midway between the earth and the sky was suspended a gleaming crypt of gold and platinum, aglow with soft lights shed from the facets of countless gems. Within a high dome hung the precious mantle of immortality, and each immortal placed a hand on the hem of the splendid robe, and said, as with one voice, We bestow this mantle upon Claus, who is called the patron saint of children. At this the mantle came away from its lofty crypt, and they carried it to the house in the Laughing Valley. The spirit of death was crouching very near to the bedside of Claus, and as the immortals approached, she sprang up and motioned them back with an angry gesture. But when her eyes fell upon the mantle they bore, she shrank away with a low moan of disappointment, and quitted that house forever. Softly and silently the immortal band dropped upon Claus the precious mantle, and it closed about him and sank into the outlines of his body and disappeared from view. It became a part of his being, and neither mortal nor immortal might ever take it from him. Then the kings and queens who had wrought this great deed dispersed to their various homes, and all were well contented that they had added another immortal to their band. And Claus slept on, the red blood of everlasting life coursing swiftly through his veins, and on his brow was a tiny drop of water that had fallen from the ever-melting gown of the queen of the water sprouts. And over his lips hovered a tender kiss that had been left by the sweet nymph Nacille. For she had stolen in when the others were gone, to gaze with rapture upon the immortal form of her foster son. And with that, I'm going to call it a night. As always, if you'd like to pick up where I'm leaving off, you can find the original on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to follow or subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get the new episodes whenever they come out. Good night and sweet dreams.